Our next speaker today is Fred Adams from the University of Delaware, where he is a professor of cognitive science and philosophy. So introducing him is in a way an easy and a difficult task. It's easy because most of you are familiar with his work. More difficult it would be to just pick some of the contributions from his list of important works. But he has published many important papers and books on topics such as theories of mental content, mark of the cognitive and extended mind, and today he's going to talk about the title of the talk is From Information to Cognition. So please welcome Fred Adams.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Leer and Orly for inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here, and thanks to all of you for such interesting talks throughout the conference. So Leer heard me give a talk that this is similar to, and so I took it when he invited me to come that he wanted to have something similar. So I work in the areas that come out of the naturalized semantics literature, Fodor, Dretske, Cummins, Millikan, people like that. And lately, the last 15 years or so, people have been talking about cognition in places in the world that, to me, doesn't seem to fit, right? So there are people talking about extended cognition. Cognition extends outside of the body onto your smartphone if you're David Chalmers, onto long division if you're Andy Clark and others. People talk about embodied cognition, that parts of the body that aren't even in the brain can be involved in cognitive processing. I've talked about my response to those things elsewhere, so I'm not going to talk about that today. But I've also discovered people talking about plants engaging in cognitive processing and bacteria engaging in cognitive processing. And so what I'm going to be doing today is thinking out loud about why people say this and why I am not finding it to be accurate. Okay. So I'll start with, of course, one of my teachers, Fred Dretske. And when he says information is in the world from the beginning, I want you to just think back to what Gualtiero said yesterday, talking about natural meaning, signs, indicators, because that's really the only sense of information that I need for my talk. I don't really need Shannon information for the things I'm going to be saying, but I need sort of Gricean indicator talk. In fact, in Dretske's 81 book, it starts with Shannon information, but by 87, when he talks about explaining behavior, and 95, when he talks about naturalizing the mind, it's all indicators. He drops the notion of Shannon information, goes to indication. So when I'm talking about information here, please just understand indication. So information is not cognition. It's necessary but not sufficient. So everyone knows, one who knows or recognizes that Tel Aviv is in Israel has to learn the fact. It's not innate. To learn, one needs the concept of Tel Aviv, the concept of Israel, and then you have to acquire the information that it's there in order to form the thought. Cognitive states are in what we call intentional states. They process aboutness. What's aboutness? A belief that Obama's president is about Obama. Desire for world peace is about world peace. A fear of global economic recession is about the global economy. One important reason why information is necessary for cognition is because information, too, has aboutness. An informational relation which exists mind independently in nature involves aboutness. The number of rings in a tree contain information about the seasons of growth. The height of the mercury column in the thermometer carries information about the temperature. So there's a law-like correlation in nature between the reading of the thermometer and the amount of heat in the thing being measured. And since there's a law-like covariation in these values, the reading on the thermometer, can be used to learn about the other, the child's temperature, precisely because the first is about the second when the thermometer is in the child's mouth. So when events happen, and their occurrence leaves a trace, a signature of their presence. The trace contains information about the events, and this means that throughout the universe, information is within its very fabric. Indeed, as you know, recently the signature of the Big Bang origin of the universe was detected. The events that contain and convey this information have existed and reverberated since the Big Bang itself, and even more recently, the strongest gravitational waves are produced by catastrophic events such as colliding black holes, the collapse of stellar cores, coalescing neutron stars, or white dwarf stars. The slightly wobbly rotation of neutron stars are not that perfect spheres, and the remnants of gravitational radiation created by the birth of the universe itself are detected in these gravitational waves. So, information is not sufficient for cognition. It's necessary. If it were sufficient, the universe itself would be one enormous thinking thing. Now, some people have come very close to saying this. Spinoza was a panpsychist, a pancognitivist, and a pantheist. Since he rejected immaterialism of Descartes, but he believed in God and he believed in mind, it turned out that the whole world had to be part of God, and the whole world had to be part of God's body, and the whole world had to be part of God's mind. So the universe itself was, again, a cognitive thinking thing for Spinoza. More recently, Timothy Sprigg, a philosopher who chaired the department at Edinburgh, was a panpsychist. Here's a quote from him. According to the panpsychist hypothesis, which I advocate, processes of physical nature have a complex system of interacting streams of experience of some sort as their inner essence. There's no reason why the physical world should not have such streams as its inner essence. An individual's state of consciousness at any moment is what it's just like now for being him or her, just as I may look at a human being and wonder what it's like, so I can look at a duck and wonder about the duck. Now, he wasn't so sure about clouds, and that's what he says in this quote, but I'm going to go right on past that. As for consciousness, which is the inner essence, in my view, of the ultimate physical processes which make up the intimate physical world, I do believe that we can only have the vaguest surmise of its nature, though it too must in some way be such as to allow us to slot into and into the right bit of the world as described physically. So again, panpsychism. Now, David Chalmers is not a pancognitivist, but he's a panpsychist in the sense that he thinks information generates qualia. So anywhere there's information, there's qualia. Here's a quote. As we move along the scale from fish to slugs through simple neural networks all the way to thermostats, where should consciousness wink out? The phenomenology of the fish and the slugs will likely not be primitive but relatively complex, reflecting the various distinctions they can make. Before phenomenology winks out altogether, we presumably will get to some sort of maximally simple phenomenology. It seems to me the most natural place for this to occur is in the system with a corresponding simple perceptual psychology such as a thermostat. Someone who finds this crazy to suppose that thermostats might have experiences at least owes us an account of just why it's crazy. Presumably this is because there's a property that thermostats lack that is obviously required for experience, but for my part, no such property reveals itself as obvious. Perhaps there's a crucial ingredient in processing that the thermostat lacks and a mouse possesses, or that a mouse lacks but a human possesses, but I can see no such ingredient, and it's not obvious that it exists. So he ends saying, with caveats that thermostats can't think or be self-conscious, Chalmers says of thermostat phenomenology that we need only imagine only something like an unarticulated flash of experience without any concepts of any thought or any complex processing in the vicinity. And with these caveats noted, it's probably fair to say that the view is a variety of panpsychism. Now, he asked, is this view too crazy? Well, I think most people think it's too crazy. But what else is needed? Information is not sufficient for cognition, but what else is needed? Behavior, but not just behavior. So what kind of behavior? Whatever else cognition is called upon, it's called upon to explain behavior. But it seems that it's got to be a kind of intentional behavior, right? So There's a classic example in intentional action theory where if somebody performs a bodily behavior scratching their nose, what did they do? It depends on what their reasons were. If they did that because their nose itched, then it was to relieve the itch. If they did it to make an example during a lecture, it was to make an example. If it was to signal a mafia hit, it was a more insidious reason behind the bodily movement. So behaviors, unlike bodily movements, are reasoned actions. A piece of behavior is a cognitive piece of behavior because there's a cognitive state in the explanation of behavior. And this is the modern view of cognitism since the demise of logical behaviorism. The logical behaviorist, by the way, I've heard that there's a new theory going around that Ryle wasn't really a behaviorist, so apologies to Ryle if I'm wrong about him. Logical behaviorists might have talked about behavior itself warranting cognitive attribution, but this is not what modern cognitivists are saying, and it's also not what those are saying from the biocentric perspective, saying that plants and bacteria think. For example, Lyon and Kaiser, Pamela Lyon and Fred Kaiser, explicitly reject a pure form of behaviorism, but they think that plants have cognitive states. So does cognition arrive when an explanation of an organism's behavioral change, in tune with its environment, is driven by information? I think this is the view that Lyon and Kaiser and bacteriologists are taking. So that many plant scientists and bacteriologists will say, yes, if the behavior of the plant is informationally driven in order to respond to environmental variation, then that's cognition. There's Fred and Pamela. So here's a quote from them. The focus on morphological and sensory motor organization makes basic behavior a congenial domain for the investigation of minimal forms of cognitive phenomena in a way that's markedly different from sophisticated contemporary versions of behaviorism. So cognition enters into the explanation of behavior when the system or the organism is doing something X in order to achieve something Y. Y is its reason, the system's own reason, not some evolutionary reason, but the system's own reason for it doing X. It's when there's a systems level explanation of the reason why something behaves that the cognition enters the story, or so I'd like to maintain. When a system does something for a reason, there are representational states of the system that fix the reason, the goal to be achieved. Information is processed at a level that rises to the level of meaning, the kind of project that Gualtiero talked about, what Grice called non-natural meaning. Rises to the level of meaning and sets the goal or purpose of the behavior. Cognitive processing is the processing of information involved in fixing and using the content of these representations. Now, here's Paco Garzon, who claims that there's plant cognition. Garzon and Kaiser agree with my notion of what it is to do something for a reason, and yet they attribute cognition to plants and look to offer analogical arguments and give the plants reasons. They find behavior in humans and animals that rises to the level of requiring cognitive states to explain, and then look for similar behaviors in plants in hopes of demonstrating that the behavior of plants too requires cognitive states to explain. And their strategy is to find cases where plants extract information from the environment in the form of natural signs or indications, and then that informational exchange drives the behavior to enhance survival in the face of environmental variance. The claim is that there's enough similarity here to cognition in humans and animals that there's cognition in plants as well. So they say plants learn, they decide, they anticipate, they have memory, among other cognitive states, but the basis for these attributions is the behavior that they display. Well, what sort of behavior? Well, one of the behaviors they cite is leaf laminas in this plant. It turns out that these plants orient their leaves at night in such a way that anticipates the future direction of the sun, even over the course of several days without tracking the direction of the sun. And Garzon thinks this involves computations over representations and offline processing. And he claims that this offline processing distances what plants do from mere reactive behavior. Now, as you know, Gualtiero's talk yesterday said that the way you go from natural meaning signs to non-natural meaning, things that can be false, is through moving from online simulations to offline simulations. So at least they're on the same wavelength as you, right? That they're thinking the same thing. That to do an offline simulation, you have to have representations that are representing either future possible states or at least states that are not actual. They're not stimulus driven. So at least they're on the right path. Garzen and Kaiser are looking to call these offline reasoning for good reasons. Cognitive representations have to be able to represent non-actual states, the goals to be achieved that did not yet exist, and they have to be able to misrepresent, to be false as when we have false beliefs. But whether plants rise to the level of having cognitive representation is still a question. Not all plant scientists agree. So now I have a series of quotes from plant scientists who disagree with other plant scientists. And here's one by Fern. He says, there's little evidence that plants or plant cells do anything that can, anything other than rudimentary processing of sensed information. He says that this alone should caution one against the term intelligence for the abilities of plants. And he would deny that plants are that there are cognitive representations in plants, and he would deny that they have misrepresentations or that they represent future states. He also objects to using the term learning for plant variation. He describes one worry. He says, it turns out that when roots were exposed to an extreme gravitational stimulus twice in 12 hours apart, the second stimulus would initiate a stimulation in cells that did not exist during the prior stimulation and thus could not have been learned. So when bacteriologists and plant scientists talk about plants learning, is their term learn metaphor? And if it is, how could one show that it is? A few years ago, I was giving a talk in Paris, and I was saying something about bacteria don't learn. And if you know the neuroscientist Shan Zhu, his hand shot up, and he said, no, bacteria learn. And so I thought, okay, I better find out why he thinks that. So, in other words, whether the term learn applies to plants is mere metaphor. They behave in ways similar to ways systems that learn to do X in order to do Y, but not because the plants have system-level reasons to turn their leaves toward the sun or grow roots toward the water. There may be evolutionary reasons why they do this, but not the plant's own reasons. Does learn that in their mouths mean learn? As Fern points out, any intelligence that might be ascribed to the plant could only reside in organs, tissues, or cells because the concept of the plant as an individual is itself a misleading one. And Garzen says he agrees with Fern that the concept of a plant as an individual rather than a collective is a misleading one. Fern also points to an error in the analogical argument comparing plants with animals. In animals, who makes the choices? It's the animal who chooses, not its cells or organs. Fern adds that in two-state event types like flowers, flowering versus not flowering in plants, the plant doesn't make a choice to flower. You get the idea. I'm going to skip ahead. So there are similarities in the behavior of the plants to the behavior of systems which are genuinely cognitive systems. The plant does X in order to do Y. It orients its leaves in order to collect sun. There are states of the plant that exchange information with the environment, and the explanation of the plant's behavior depends on the exchange of this information. Well, those things are all true in cognitive systems too. But there are dissimilarities as well. The explanation of the plant's doing X in order to do Y is not in terms of the plant's own reasons, nor in terms of its learning. The explanation is in terms of selection at the level of the species. Second, nothing in the plant means sun in the way that Gualtiero was trying to analyze, a non-natural meaning, or represents to this particular plant a reason to move towards the sun. And the plant does not learn in its lifetime that it should bend in this direction in order to collect sun. Well, what about bacteria? So Ben Jacob attributes to bacteria faculties that represent the origin of cognition, or what he calls precursors of cognition, or cognition's fundamental elements. And here he says, the reason that I use the term rudimentary cognitive function to describe chemotaxis, where bacteria tumble in a direction of a food source or away from a toxin, is associated with the fact that decisions to tumble or not tumble is not simply pre-programmed, but involves assignment of individual meaning. The decision is performed according to the additional environmental conditions, the food concentration, and other factors such as temperature, humidity, hardness of the substrate, the existence of toxic materials, the internal state of the cell, whether it's starving, according to internally stored information of specific cells, previous starvation or other stress, and signals received from other cells. But what makes this behavior cognitive? Surely not just complexity. In fact, at one point, Ben Jacob mentions the aforementioned description of chemotaxis can be executed by a robot equipped with sensors and information processing unit that's pre-programmed to control the taxes according to concentration gradients. But of course, the robot's behavior need not be explained by cognitive processing. So why must the bacterial behavior be so explained? Complexity alone can't be the key factor rendering this chemotaxis or other behavior cognitive. So why do they think this activity is cognitive? Again, for a few reasons. First, they think the explanation of the behavior does indeed require the exploitation of information by the organism from the environment. And they think that a mere mechanical or chemical or genetic explanation alone will not enable the scientist to explain the behavior of the organisms. Shapiro points out that E. coli have the capacity to detect the difference between glucose and lactose and turn on or off the system, the so-called lac operant system. Internal to them, that chemically processes the difference in the substance, and what is more, the mechanism by which they do this can be represented as in computational steps. The information from all these sensors feeds into a computational network that includes lac operant regulation, so that the cell can compute the following non-trivial Boolean proposition. If lactose present and glucose not present, and cell can synthesize active lac-Z and lac-Y, then transcribe lac-ZYA from lac-P. This kind of explanation rises above the level of mere physics alone, perhaps, mere chemistry alone, perhaps, and maybe above biology alone, but it does so because of its reference to information that it's extracting from the environment. So the obvious question is, what's the next level of explanation up from biology? Well, it's psychology and psychological states and processes that exploit information. So it's quite understandable why a scientist or a philosopher may believe that cognition that's exhibited by bacteria or plants has to be explained at the level of psychology. Ben Jacob also maintained that bacteria learn and that they behave differently in the future based upon past interactions. Upon meeting antibiotic factors in the environment, they reshape the bacterial colony. Thus, they supposedly learn from past experience to better cope with the second encounter with the same antibiotic. But again, does learn mean learn? Interesting to me is Ben Jacob's own explanation of the mechanism by which the so-called learning takes place. He says, one possibility is the effect is connected with a genetic shift in the population. Another involves heritability at the level of the genome. And Hopkin, another bacteriologist, says this about learning. Associative learning in dogs and humans happens over the course of the organism's lifetime and involves modifications of the strength of connections between neurons in the brain. Tavazoy says the learning that we have discovered in bacteria occurs over long evolutionary timescales and involves changes in the connections between networks of genes. So if this is learning, it's learning that does not take place in the lifetime of the individual, bacterium, and that is represented at the level of the gene. That doesn't sound like the sense of learning that we normally attribute to animals or to humans, where learning does take place in the lifetime of the individual, and it's not only taking place because it's encoded in the genes. So the required contextual information is cooperatively generated by using internal stored information as well as new information extracted from the environment. Thus, these bacteria only require genetically stored information on how to build information processing faculties, and how these capabilities, along with guidelines for using them, may be employed to generate new knowledge as required. So here's another quote attributing knowledge to them. Knowledge of the kind Ben Jacob wants to attribute to bacteria requires, at the very least, that they believe things truly, and that their beliefs aren't accidentally true, but have something like tracking conditions. Now, bacteria surely have tracking mechanisms. They need structures that rise to the level of meaning, symbols that have the capacity to say things that are true or false if they're going to know things. But there's nothing in the science to indicate that they have anything like beliefs, non-natural meaning. So, as everyone in this room knows, beliefs have semantic opacity. Matt may believe the evening star is bright, the evening star is Venus, but Matt may not know that. He may not believe that Venus is bright. But if a bacterium is tumbling in the direction of a sugar and the sugar is corn-based, then the bacteria is tumbling in the direction of a sugar that's corn-based. There's no opacity. So again, there are similarities. Cognitive systems control their behavior by using informational exchange with their environment and in modifying their behavior accordingly as they set and update new goals, intentional states with semantic contents. And bacteria sense the environment and perform internal information processing according to internally stored information to extract latent information embedded in the complexity of the environment. The latent information is then converted into usable or active information that affects the bacterium activity as well as intracellular changes. And to coordinate such activity, to coordinate such cooperative venture, bacteria have developed various methods of biochemical communication, quorum sensing, by using a variety of mediators ranging from simple molecules to polymers, peptides, complex proteins, genetic material, and even cassettes of genetic information. Plasmids and viruses. The intercellular communication is afforded by the evolution of highly complex and intricate intracellular signaling mechanisms involving signal transduction networks and genetic languages to turn genes on or off. But again, there's still dissimilarities. There's an informational exchange between the system and the environment, and behavioral change based on the exchange. The resulting behavior is purposive. The bacteria is doing X in order to do Y for appropriate values of X and Y, but they are not doing things for their reasons that they acquire in their lifetime, nor do they possess, and they do not possess representations that have non-natural meaning, semantic meaning or semantic content. It seems to us that bacteria behave in the ways they do because they're tracking events and conditions via information. They process about their environments, and it's this information processing condition of tracking that they share with genuine cases of knowledge. But since they lack beliefs, concepts, meanings, the higher level discriminating representations associated with genuine knowledge, what they do doesn't seem to be really cognition. It doesn't seem to be really knowledge that they possess. But they don't need knowledge because they have information-driven event tracking, and that's one of the main ingredients of knowledge already. And for their purposes, that's all they really need to get food, avoid toxic substances, and adapt to their surroundings. We, on the other hand, need more to survive and function properly in our environments. We need the higher order cognitive functions that do have beliefs, concepts, and knowledge. So, information versus cognition for plants and bacteria. Information can't be false in this indicator notion. Cognitive states can be. Information is not at the level of meaning. Cognitive states are representational states with meaning or semantic content. Informational states can't represent things which don't exist. Cognitive states can. They can represent the present, the past, the future, and possibly even the fictional. These natural sign states are stimulus dependent. Cognitive states aren't. One can only see, hear, taste, smell what's present, or at least once was. But cognitive states can be for or about things present, past, or perhaps that do not even exist. So I can desire to move faster than the speed of light, or desire world peace, even if my desires will always be thwarted. So, cognition doesn't come to exist merely from information-driven behavioral change. Cognition comes to exist when there are systems-based reasons for an organism's behavior and when it does things for a reason, its reasons, and it has goals. That's it. I'm done.
Time for questions.
Yes, I want to ask to make some comments and ask you what you think
Okay.
about it. The first is that I think that there are several notions of cognition.
Yeah.
For example, when I'm thinking about the work on autopoiesis of Maturana and Morello, they define cognition as the adaptive behavior of an autopoietic system which has adaptive plasticity, and adaptive plasticity is something that is inherent, according to their view, in the very nature of the autopoietic system. So if this is the definition, and you need to have in the system sensors and effectors, and an interpretation system of signals that are coming through it, then for them, this is cognition. Now, you can argue that this is not cognition, but this is a kind of interpretation, and they interpret things in this way. Now, people, Maturana and Perella stretch this to different levels of biological organization, but somebody like Alvaro Moreno, for example, does not. And when he's talking about autopoietic systems, he makes distinctions between different types of systems, with and without nervous systems, prokaryotic and eukaryotic and so on. So that's one thing. So that's a different way of carving the same kind of space, but it does give a particular definition of cognition. The other thing is about learning. You gave the examples of Eschenheimer probe and about bacteria. I think that the bacterial case is very problematic indeed when you're talking about learning. If you define learning in a particular way, so the usual way that learning is defined is that there is some process of encoding, or that there is some signals that changes the state of the system, and then that there is a particular state of the system, maybe many states are generated. One particular state is retained, or traces of the states are retained. States, engrams, or traces of a particular reactions are retained in a latent form, and then they are retrieved. They can be retrieved. Now, if you accept this kind of definition of learning, and this is a classical definition of learning in the learning literature, for example, by Dye and many, many other people, if you accept this definition, then eukaryotic cells with epigenetic systems and with epigenetic memory can learn. They can learn very simply, not associative learning, but learning by sensitizations. There is, I will not go into details, but there is this kind, but according to this definition, they learn without any problem, and it is during their own lifetime. You do not need cell division, you do not need evolution and selection for this to happen between organisms. So I think that you can say, if you accept this kind of definition, that, and you may not accept it, that there is learning in non-neural organisms at a very simple level, at the epigenetic level, within single cells. We can actually see it. We can see it in Paramecium, for example, at the behavioral level. In Paramecium, not in bacteria. We can see sensitization and habituation it's a non-associative learning, but it is learning, and it is happening during the lifetime of the beast, of the unicellular organism. So I think that the distinction that you are making between different levels of representation and between different levels of cognition is very valuable. But I don't think that you can say that learning is something that is exclusive to neural organisms. And I think in the case of plants, it's a very, very different. It's a much more complicated than Paralysium, because they're modular organisms, and we have to think about the systemic interactions within the hormonal systems and so on and so forth. Very, very complicated. But I'm absolutely sure that I can make a very good argument for the learning of single eukaryotic cells within the body and as unicellular organisms.
Okay, thank you for that. So when I first thought about this, I thought that there are three possible ways to interpret what's going on. One is maybe they were taking something like a Dennettian intentional stance. The other possibility was that they were defining terms differently, that they were defining cognition differently than I am. They're defining learning differently than I am.
But I'm not sure how you define learning.
Well, let's leave it open for now, but my response is, if the claim is that what we mean by cognition is a little different, what we mean by learning is a little different, then my answer is, okay, then I don't really have anything to disagree about, because I'm not saying that they don't have cognition, they just don't have cognition that satisfies the kinds of properties that I was pointing to. So I asked at least Kaiser and Lyon, I said, is that what's going on, or are we just using terms in different ways? And Kaiser said, no, we think that there's cognition and learning in exactly the same sense that you do.
If I may, I think that learning, again, I'm not committed to plants, but learning in a very simple sense, in the sense of sensitization and habituation, maybe even very limited associative learning. It's very disputable in the Paralysium case, but there are experiments that suggest that. It does exist, and it is the same definition of learning that we're using for neural organisms. We're using it at a very different level, the same conceptual structure. I mean, of course not the same mechanism, of course not the same instantiation, and that's absolutely important. But I think that the conceptual structure is the same.
Yeah, hi. To be a bit provocative, if you press the notion of its own reasons,
Yes.
which we've been using several times,
Yes.
aren't you going to end up with free will being a necessary condition for
Free will?
cognition?
No, I don't think so.
Because its own reasons, I mean, maybe our reasons aren't our own.
Well, I think free will is compatible with determinism. I'm a compatibilist, so I think that, yeah. So I don't think it's incompatible. Yeah. But I'm not necessarily saying anything about freedom. I'm just saying that the reasons have to be the system's reasons, not some evolutionary explanation for how this was selected for without the creature doing any reasoning at all. Right? So somebody might say, what's the reason? Somebody might say, what's the reason why plants are phototropic? And you can give a reason, but you're not giving a plant, you're not saying the plant is thinking, got to go that way, right? It's not doing any reasoning, though there might be an evolutionary explanation. So when you say what's the reason, you mean what's the evolutionary explanation? But so I'm just saying that when a creature system is a cognitive system, it's doing things for reasons, and the reasons are coming out of its non-natural meaning representations at some level. So not everything in a cognitive system has to have cognitive representations, but there have to be some in there somewhere. That's the idea.
Yeah, so thank you for the talk. So I just have so you presented two key similarities.
Yes.
So I wanted to get question the two, or at least
Okay.
challenge them.
Yeah.
So first of all, I don't quite see why the fact that the reasons are my own reasons are so important for cognition. So we know, for instance, that we have innate representations, right? We have, for instance, maybe we think that the amygdala, activation in the amygdala represents fear. Fear perception represents like danger around, right? Now, many of our representations will be like that, and there will be there will be just an evolutionary reason for having that. It says that, it's not me that I'm choosing to, there's just an evolutionary reason for having that representation at that moment.
Well, I can have an innate desire coupled with a belief to do something, but it's still my reason for doing it is because I want it and I have beliefs about how to get it.
Yeah, but we will have many kinds of, innate representations, and that's, to me, that sounds like, a plausible.
That's fine, as long as those are desires and they rise to the level of being mental representations in the sort of model that Gualtiero was trying to talk about. They could be innate desires, but they're coupled with concepts and other things that have meaning that are acquired so that there will be systems level reasons, in my view.
And I think so. So just to clarify, so why do you think that there is no misrepresentation in the case of bacteria? So, think about quorum sensing, right? So there's this kind of bacteria that produces this peptide, and when a bacteria senses that there are enough molecules in the vicinity, then it produces an antibiotic, something like that. That's the behavior. Now, it happens that all the bacteria also produce the same peptide for the reasons. So if a particular bacteria senses a high concentration of peptide, but it's not the right kind of peptide produced by their own fellows, but and he produces the antibiotic. That seems to me like, and that's performed because this internal state saying, oh yeah, there's enough peptide, so produce this thing. That looks to me like is misrepresenting the presence of many fellows.
Well, but you've got to show that it's misrepresentation and not something like correct disjunctive or multiply disjunctive sensing, right? So that there's a multiply disjunctive trigger for the response. There's no misrepresentation. It's now correctly representing a disjunction. And one of the disjunctions is the false, what you want to say is the false, and I'll say, but how do you know it's not a true disjunctive representation? So it's the disjunction problem, which you know and maybe don't love, but it's that problem, right? You got it. You got it. Yeah.
I don't love it. Yeah.
But you got my response, right?
Yeah. I got it.
We have one question. Thanks very much. I think there's a crude analogy that could be made between our current collection of ideas about cognition, information, learning, perception, decision-making, reasoning, and so on, and how it might evolve, how those ideas might evolve in the future, with ideas about chemistry and kinds of matter in the distant past. So people used to talk about salt and water and air and fire and whatever, and now we have a theory of the atomic structure of matter, which involves lots of different kinds of elements, and then that huge variety of chemicals, different kinds of molecular structures, with all sorts of new information about what they can and can't do and so on. And I suspect, you might agree with this, that we're now trying to characterize the variety of cognitive and mental information processing phenomena with a conceptual system that's about as useful for that purpose as the ideas about kinds of matter and their properties and behavior 400 or 500 or 2,000 years ago were for what we're now doing in chemistry labs and understanding digestion and understanding quantum and so on. In other words, we are trying to make do with a very much oversimplified collection of concepts for a collection of phenomena that the concepts are just not adequate for.
Well, I guess I don't disagree with you. What I'd like to think is that someday the kinds of things that I'm interested in doing in naturalized semantics will tie into the kinds of things our first speaker's doing with understanding sensory mechanisms. That somehow those high-level and neuro-computational level explanations will start to fit together.
We have some fragments that are in different communities.
Yeah.
So for instance, linguists will say when our visual system is used to perceive what's up there, there'll be words and phrases and sentences and tree structures and so on, whereas the brain scientists may not use any of those concepts to explain what's happening in perception, and they'll both be saying something that's correct. But he should be ignoring.
Well,
some
hopefully
conventions.
there'll be a way to make sense of both in a way that doesn't make our normal ways of thinking about ourselves go completely away. You know, not a Churchlandian eliminativism. Hopefully that it won't be that.
Well, there are lots of stuff about what people used to say about food. And
Sure,
that
sure, yeah.
isn't undermined by what we know about chemistry.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Fred. It was illuminating, and I really like the levels of cognition that you're trying to chart here. But I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more about what we gain by describing plants at an individual level as being cognitive, when it seems that we can maybe suffice with just a behaviorist explanation of what they do. And I know that Michael Lachman has done much work on what we can describe at the species level, and see how species of plants actually learn from the environment, and he shows how we can use neutral information to show increase in fitness, etc. But that's over the lifetime of not a single plant, but the species.
Yeah, well, I read a paper by a man who used to teach at the University of Wisconsin in the bacteriology. And he said that in the 20s and 30s, in his 20s and 30s, he was trying to make sense of these various behaviors of bacteria. And he said it wasn't until he started to think of them as cognitive creatures that he could start to make progress. So I think that the people who are attributing cognition to plants and to bacteria, except for Eva's worries that if there's another way of understanding what's going on here, it's true. It's not just a pragmatic or an instrumental account. But I think that when they attribute high-level cognitive capacity, that the reason they're doing this is because they find that just limiting themselves to physics, chemistry, and maybe cell biology doesn't give them the tools they need to explain the complexity and the richness of the behavior of these organisms.
At the individual level.
Yeah, so they want to describe them as having cognition. Now, I don't, right? I'm trying to say there is no cognition there, so I'm pulling back. But I'm using cognition in a sense that involves reasons, something like thinking, something where you have representations that can be true or false, can be put together, in Ron's talk, put together in something like a language of thought to generate strings of unlimited complexity and principle, understand systematicity. Right? So what I think cognition is probably what Jerry Fodor thinks cognition is.
We do have time for our last question.
So I wanted to make a comment that is in the direction of what wherever we are. And I think as a biologist, I would ask the question, put it in an evolutionary light, and say, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So I would ask, what is the evolutionary function of learning? Why did learning evolve? And I think without learning, the only thing that can tell you between good and bad is selection. So whoever dies did the wrong thing, whoever lives did the right thing. But this is, you pay a lot for every bit of information you get. So I think that learning then comes as a way for individuals to be able to tell good from bad without having to die, and at the lowest level. And then I think that there's many different mechanisms to do that. How can you know good from bad without dying? And so at our level, we have very sophisticated mechanisms where we can even analyze if I'll go over there, a rock will follow me and it might be dangerous. And whereas maybe other organisms can say, this once, it wasn't so good, I won't do it again. So I would classify learning like this, saying learning is a mechanism for an organism to learn to distinguish between good and bad. And then you could put many things under this umbrella. And of course, there's many different mechanisms to that, like Eva pointed out.
Yeah, but as soon as you take this offline and you're going to reason about future possibilities, then you need really high, you need capacities that the low-level stuff may not have.
Please join me and thank Adam for this.
Thank you. Thank you.